and welcome. Alright, so today we're going to be talking about common rat illnesses. My cat is already on her way over here. You gonna shark tail it? Yeah, shark tail. Anyway, so a lot of people who are thinking about getting rats are under the impression that they're not going to get sick very often. I've heard people say that when they got their first rats, they thought that they would just live comfortably and then pass once they're really old and they're sleep peacefully. No. If you do any research on rats, one of the first things you will see is that they get sick. They get sick a lot. They get sick honestly more often than any other pet I've had. So let's get into it. So a couple of things. This isn't a comprehensive list of everything they can get. Rats can get some really weird things. This isn't even necessarily all the common things, because there's a couple of things I could have had on here, but in my experience aren't as common. So this is just things that I feel like even if you only get, say, 3 rats and then you're done, you are likely to see. Doesn't mean you will see them. Doesn't mean that any of these are guaranteed to happen. You could get rats and have them be perfectly healthy for their entire life. I've never seen that, but it's theoretically possible. Or you could get rats and they could get just the most bizarre stuff you've ever seen that isn't even on this list. This is just a list of the things that are the most likely things to happen to your rat, basically. So, let's start. So, let's start with stuff that they're likely to even come home with, which would be like external parasites, such as mites or lice. So, this isn't uncommon. Rats always have mites. So they usually exist in small quantities on their skin, and they take care of them by grooming them naturally. So the thing with that is they are rat-specific mites, so they're not going to bother you, and typically they don't bother the rats either. But when rats get stressed, such as when they're ill, or when they're going through intros, or when they're alone, or when they're first coming into your home, it is harder for them to groom those mites away because their immune system is weaker. And the colonies of mites could grow, and you'll notice that they get scabby and itchy and just like lose fur and stuff. And under those circumstances, you want to, if you're very new to rats, you want to get them something called Revolution. If you're in the US, the UK has over-the-counter stuff, the US does not. So you'll just take them to the vet and you'll ask for Kitten Revolution, and it'll be 1 drop for small rats, 2 drops for large rats. Revolution has a very low toxicity, so you don't necessarily have to worry about overdosing them too much. Obviously, don't pour a whole bottle on them, but they should be fine. Now, lice is something different. So like mites, they don't exist on the rat naturally. Those will usually come in from, like, if you're in an unclean environment at a pet store, for example, or on the bedding. You can freeze the bedding to try and reduce the chances of it, but a lot of people, myself included, get really big things of bedding that are hard to freeze. I do have a chest freezer in my garage that I just put literally all the rat stuff into. The second I get it, it goes into the chest freezer, unless it's something like the Santa chips, which I've never had an issue with. But if you don't have that option, just monitor, and you take care of the lice the same way you take care of mites, which is with, and if you're in the US, Revolution. Another thing that they can get that is skin related is ringworm, which is a fungal infection. A lot of people think ringworm is a parasite. It's not. It's a fungal infection. So this can happen through, again, unsanitary environments and pet stores. It can happen if you get your rats from a backyard breeder. Sometimes it just happens. It can come in on contaminated bedding. It can come in on contaminated items. You can catch it and then give it to them. They can give it to you because it is a zoonotic infection. It can also be asymptomatic, meaning that your rats can be a carrier for it and they don't have the telltale signs of ringworm, but they can still have it and then pass it on to you. That's not as common, I find, but it is a possibility. And with this, it's pretty simple. You go to the store and you get basically like an athlete's foot cream, like, for example, Lamisil, and you just apply it to the rat twice a day and it should clear it up. You can go the route of taking them to the vet and getting oral antifungals and a topical cream. Generally, that's very expensive and it's a long treatment, but if you want to go that route, just make sure it's taken care of, you can. Next up, let's talk about the big one, which is respiratory issues. So rats, you'll hear it if you are interested in rats at all, you will see it, which is they have very sensitive respiratory systems. And they're small animals. They weren't exactly bred to have strong respiratory systems, so they are very sensitive. My cat is playing with my pen. You're rude. So the most common respiratory issue they're going to have is an upper respiratory infection, or URI, and that's when they'll be making sounds with their nose. I've heard it called pigeon noises. I've heard it called guinea pig noises. It can sound very crackly. It's just if they're making noise with their nose, that's an upper respiratory infection. And you do want to get this taken care of. If they start that, you want to get them on antibiotics. The most common antibiotics will be enrofloxacin, also known as Baytril, and doxycycline. And you want those to go together because it will knock out anything they have. Now, most vets will try to just give you Enro and not double up unless it's a severe infection, and this can sometimes work if it's not a severe infection. And some vets will try to give you something called azithromycin, which is another antibiotic, and it is good for respiratory infections, but I will say I have only ever had it be effective a handful of times. My old vet would use azithro. So for example, it worked on Orville. When I brought Orville home, she had an upper respiratory infection, and it wasn't New Home sniffles because it lasted for longer than it should have. And when I took her in, they put her on azithro, and it did take care of the issue. However, Cappy's rat, who we got at the same time, her name was Spectre, she also had an upper respiratory infection, and it did not help her, and that rat literally never got better. We had her on antibiotics on and off for her whole life, but for the first year, all we could get her on was azithro because that's what our vet used, and it never worked. And I do suspect that that is why she lived to be about 1 year and 7 months, I think. She got a pituitary tumor. So yeah, for the next 7 months after we had moved and she was on proper medication, it didn't work, and I think that's because she had lung scarring from a poorly treated respiratory infection. Now, if left untreated, it can develop into pneumonia, which is where there's fluid in the lungs. And under that circumstance, you definitely want to get them put on both Enro and Doxy, and possibly get them a steroid as well to help them fight off the pneumonia. Now, there's typically signs leading up to respiratory problems. They don't typically pop up out of nowhere. However, rats are very good at hiding symptoms, and there can be silent respiratory infections or silent respiratory problems where they look fine or they sound fine. So you also want to see if they have heavy breathing. So like, especially if it's like heavy abdominal breathing, that is a sign that they are in respiratory distress without showing any other symptoms, because they can have heavy breathing but still be acting normally, have the right amount of energy, and otherwise doing okay. But it can develop into something worse. So that is something to keep an eye on as well. This next one is something I've talked about many times. This is the hill I will die on, which is hormonal aggression. So the thing with hormonal aggression, I do consider it a medical problem personally. So basically, rats, as they get older, when their hormones start to develop, especially around 6 months old for males, they have a surge of hormones, and it'll sometimes settle and sometimes won't. And basically, they can become aggressive. And this can get extremely bad. It can be mild. There's a whole range of it. But basically, if your rat starts to display hormonal signs, such as being poofy, trying to bite, starting a lot of fights, excessive humping, excessive scent marking, that sort of thing, your best option is to go and get them spayed or neutered. Now, a lot of breeders in the US will tell you to basically just unalive them if this is what they're doing, because there's no saving them. That is not true. I have many rats who have been hormonally aggressive that I have gotten spayed or neutered, and they are fine. They're living their best life. They are perfectly happy, and I will continue to fight for the people to spay and neuter the rats when it's necessary. Now, if you do decide to spay or neuter, there is a period afterward where they're still going to be aggressive because their hormones need to calm down. And for males, this lasts anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks at least. I've heard some people say it takes a lot longer. Sometimes it takes a little less. but 6 to 8 is generally how long it'll last. With female rats, it's a little less, so I believe it's 2 to 4 weeks. With Sailor, it was 4 weeks. With them, it was more like 2-ish. So with the weather girls, I'm pointing at them as if you can see them. But yeah, it's less time with females typically. I will also say that with females, they tend to still be a little bit spicy afterward, where neutering usually is very effective on males. Now, again, they are living very happy lives. They're very sweet with me. They are in a group, so I still advocate for spaying, even though, in my experience, it's not as effective. Next up, we have abscesses. So abscess is an infection, typically on the skin, but it can happen internally as well, that has been walled off by the body. So you'll see a bump on your rat. There's typically a bruised color to it, and it's typically very hard, and it should be adhered to the skin. So it moves with the skin, not underneath the skin. So, and these are very simple to treat. I've seen some people get a little worried over them, but typically they do not need veterinary intervention. So basically with an abscess, what you want to do is you want to do warm compresses. So I would take a rag, I'd run some warm water over it so that it's not hot to the touch, because if you think it's hot, they're going to think it's hot. And you just press that to the abscess. The longer the better, but as long as they'll let you. And you do that twice a day, and the infection will eventually come to the surface and form a scab. And the scab will then either peel off, or you can peel it off. And you clean the abscess out, which, yes, I know is gross, but you do what you gotta do. And then you want to clean the area. So you can either do a betadine dilution or a Hibiclens dilution. And you just take a Q-tip and swab it out, and you do that until it heals, basically. And hopefully the abscess won't reform. If it does, you start the process over again. It only needs veterinary intervention if it won't scab over, allowing you to clean it, or if it's in a very awkward place. Like I had Hopper, who had an abscess right by her urethra, which was actually 2 abscesses stacked on top of each other. Or if you trying to treat it at home isn't helping, if it just keeps recurring over and over and over again, that's when you take them to the vet and have the vet professionally clean it out with, their high-grade medications. Next, let's talk about heart failure. So I did talk about this briefly in last week's video about my rat Dorothy, who passed away from heart failure. But let's go into more detail this week. So, heart failure is more common in rats than vets will lead you to believe. Because heart failure often masquerades as a respiratory infection. So the early symptoms of heart failure are typically just heavy breathing and sometimes a crackling sound in their chest, because it can cause congestion. If antibiotics are consistently not working, especially if the rat is older, though heart failure can happen at all ages. I've had it happen to a 4-week-old rat that was in late stage heart failure when I brought her home. While it can happen in all stages of life, it does typically happen to older rats. So if antibiotics have not worked and they're still heavy breathing, got a little bit of congestion sounds going on, it's worth trying to see if your vet will give you the medications for heart failure or trialing them on heart failure medications. In my experience, vets don't do this. They want definitive proof that it's heart failure, but unfortunately, x-rays, ultrasounds, listening to the chest, all those are typically inconclusive. So you can try, they're probably not going to show you anything. So the medications you would need would be a diuretic, an ACE inhibitor, and sometimes a beta blocker, but not usually. Now, as heart failure progresses, you'll see things like cold extremities, like their tail and feet. Sometimes they'll even turn blue. Some late stage signs can be that they basically have fluid retention, which is where their body's just holding onto fluid. It can drain into their abdomen. This is not a very common symptom, according to sawmill rats, I believe is where I read that, but I have seen it multiple times in my rats, so I don't know how uncommon it is either. Some other symptoms are they'll have random bursts of energy followed by long periods of lethargy. And it's because it's just really hard for them to breathe, so they're very tired. They don't really want to do anything. Eating can be iffy, like Dorothy was eating till the end, but some rats just don't feel like it. They're just too tired. Now, if they do have heart failure, even if you get the medications, you are basically just keeping them comfortable. It is essentially palliative care. There is no curing it or fixing it in rats, but hopefully if you can get the medications, they can still have many more months. Next, let's talk about HLD. So HLD I've talked about many times before. Ducky has it, my old rat Sailor had it, and my old rat Humdrum had it. So basically, for almost the entirety of my channel, I've had a rat with HLD. And HLD is hind leg degeneration, and it's where the rat's body slowly goes paralyzed from the back end forward. So typically, my cat is chewing on my pen. Typically, it will start with, say, like a limp tail or just like a little bobbing walk where their back end just kind of bobs as they move. And then it'll move to not being able to use their legs, to dragging their back feet, on and on. It just kind of creeps up the body. It is typically caused by the kidneys losing some of their function. It's not like acute kidney failure, which can happen very quickly, but it is still not a great thing to have happen, but it is a very gradual thing, and you can keep them comfortable. You can make sure their cage is laid out in a way that they can still use. You can treat it with things like flaxseed oil or Pacotin, just to slow down the process and give them as much time as they can have. Like Humdrum, for example, had it for 7 or 8 months before I put her to sleep, and that wasn't why I put her to sleep. And then Sailor had it for, I think, about the same amount of time. I did end up putting Sailor to sleep because of her HLD, because it just had progressed to the point where she was no longer happy, basically. All right, next, let's talk about strokes. So rats can have strokes. Strokes tend to have neurological symptoms. So there's no way to see them coming, unfortunately. It's only afterward that you realize what's happened. So the most common symptom of stroke is that the rat seems to have lost function in half their body, whether it's like the back end or sometimes it's one side. And those are usually for severe strokes, and it's very easy to tell what's happening. For less severe strokes, sometimes it can masquerade as a pituitary tumor, which we'll talk about in a minute. For more minor strokes, it can look anything from like weird sudden onset HLD, which doesn't happen. As I said, HLD is a very gradual thing. Or my rat Rowley, I suspect, had a stroke. She was still getting around fine, but she was breathing harder, which is a symptom of having a stroke. And she was choking on all of her food, no matter how small, large, soft, crunchy, no matter what it was, she was choking on it, which choking can also be a symptom of a stroke. So when your rat has a stroke, you can go and take them to the vet and get them a steroid shot, which might help alleviate the symptoms. But typically, unfortunately, once they've had one stroke, if they survive that one, they will probably have a second one, and that one is usually more severe, and from what I've seen, does take them out. So, you know, if they survive the first one and they have a pretty generally good quality of life, they are on palliative care at that point, and you're just trying to make them as comfortable as possible for whatever time they have left. And now we're to the big one, which is tumors. So here's the thing. Here's the thing with rats, y'all. Rats are very, very good at getting tumors. They get them in weird places. They get them in inconvenient places. They get them whether they're spayed or not, whether they're male or female. Dwarfs are less likely to get them, but they still get them. Rats develop tumors so easily, so quickly. It is something you will almost certainly have to deal with no matter what kind of rat you get. So let's kind of talk about why that is. The most common type of tumor is a mammary tumor. Rats are mostly mammary tissue. They have so much that removing mammary tissue when they remove a mammary tumor is just kind of a ridiculous notion. Most experienced vets, when they see a lump, they just kind of go on assuming it's a mammary tumor. They won't even do a fine-needle aspiration or anything like that. They'll just assume it's a mammary tumor and lop it off, because that's how common they are. Mammary tumors are a benign tumor, meaning they're not cancerous, and they are more common in female rats, but male rats can get them. Ezra, for example, currently has one, which I'll be taking care of fairly soon, and they tend to happen around once they become seniors, which is generally considered to be around 18 months old. So that's the most common time frame, but I've seen them happen to rats that were under a year old all the way up to over 2 is like that's the time frame. So the best course of option is to just take them to the vet and have it removed. Some mammary tumors grow really fast, some are very slow. Some rats are prone to them to the point where they get 3 or 4 at once. Some get 1 and then you have it removed and they never get another one. It's just kind of like luck of the draw with that. So just get it removed and they should be fine. They can also get internal tumors or malignant tumors or cancerous tumors. These tend to not end well. So internal tumors oftentimes will attach to the organs on the inside and become really hard to remove very quickly. And there's nothing you can do about that. They get them in their lungs, they can get them on their heart, they can get them in their stomach or in the bladder. My rat Bug got one in her nose. If you've been around for a bit, you might remember her. The malignant tumors they get externally tend to be a little bit different from mammary tumors. Mammary tumors tend to be a little bit softer, a little bit squishier, and movable. Whereas the more malignant tumors sometimes adhere very tightly to the body. They tend to be harder. They tend to be very aggressive. They feel lumpy sometimes, or sometimes they're black. They sometimes develop like holes. That's what happened with humdrum. They're very obviously a different type of tumor once you've had experience anyway. Then there's something called a Zimbald's gland tumor, and that's one that they get along their jawline, typically up by their ears. These tend to be very hard, adhered, and deeply rooted to the jawline. And the thing with those is they are always fatal because they're not removable. And as they grow, they start to push the jaw out of alignment. And if left unattended, they will break the rat's jaw, which is extremely painful. And so basically, if your rat gets one of those, your best option is to monitor them. And when they start showing signs of pain, or if you notice that the jaw looks like it's being pushed out of alignment, take them in and have them put to sleep, because it is the kindest thing to do for them. And finally, the very last thing we're going to be talking about is pituitary tumors. Pituitary tumors are a brain tumor on the pituitary gland, obviously. There's several different kinds of pituitary tumors, but they all have similar symptoms, which are neurological symptoms. So it kind of starts out with like a slight lack of coordination. They get kind of mouthy, so like if you put your hand in front of them or a piece of food in front of them, they grab it, but they do it in like an uncoordinated, not all their way. My old rat Button Bright, her first and only symptom for a long time is that when she'd groom me, she would put way too much pressure on me. It wasn't mouthiness because she was acting completely fine. She was just biting really hard when she was grooming me. And she did that with everyone. Like Cappy might even still have scars from it because she wouldn't pull her hand back because she was sad. Other symptoms include, this is more of like an experienced owner thing, but some of you might get it. And not all their look in their eyes where they're not completely aware. It's really hard to describe. You look at them and you realize something's wrong because they're just kind of disoriented. They'll lose coordination in their hands to the point where they can't hold treats. They will sometimes lose coordination in their back legs as well, to where they're just kind of wobbly and not steady. They'll walk in circles or walk around aimlessly. My old rat Willow had a pituitary tumor. When she was like, right before I had her put to sleep, she wouldn't walk in circles, but she would just go until I went and picked her up because she wanted to be with me. She was one of my heart rats. We were very close. So like she would go in a straight line toward where she thought I was, and she'd just keep going until she reached me or until I picked her up. So it's that kind of thing. They can sometimes just be really lethargic, out of it. Cappy's rat Wicket would just sleep. She just slept. And then it wasn't until like we made her eat that we realized her coordination was off. They sometimes also get a bulgy eye, and that's because the tumor is pressing their eye out of its socket. Now, pituitary tumors can't be cured. Some of them can be treated with a drug called cabergoline. So they'll give you prednisone, which is also a steroid. The prednisone reduces inflammation around the brain where the tumor is pressing on it, and it's a short-term effect where at some point it's not going to continue to help the rat. They will decline quickly, typically within a couple of weeks. cabergoline can be effective, but it's only on a certain hormonally charged tumor. And it can even shrink the tumor. Rats can get sometimes a really long time on cabergoline. Depending on where you live, it might be very hard to get a hold of. Where I live, it's not easy. I've tried many times and it's just not easy. Again, since it's only on one type of pituitary tumor, it might not help. Under which circumstances, the kindest thing you can do is unfortunately let your rat go, because it is not a pretty, it's not pretty, I'll say. It's very sad and they're in pain, and it's just kind of let them go. So, on that unhappy note, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, you know what to do. All the fun stuff down below, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye!